Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian angle on what's going on in the world. I'm joined as I am every week by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back for another round of Libertarian Angle.
It's great to be here once again with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, Richard, as we've seen with the Trump administration, we've got chaos and crises everywhere, particularly in the immigration arena. But one of the things that people are not yet talking about, but that they will inevitably talk about, is the crisis of the welfare state. And so I thought maybe we ought to talk about this impending crisis long before it occurs, that we've become so accustomed to America being a welfare state that hardly anyone, with the exception of libertarians, of course, questions the entire apparatus of the welfare state. That is, the notion that the government should wield the power to take money from one group of people and give it to another group of people. And, of course, I'm talking about the crown jewel of the welfare state, Social Security, but there's also Medicare and Medicaid and farm subsidies and education grants and foreign aid to dictators and others. You've got this massive transfer program that is really part and parcel of America's governmental system and really our economic system. And, of course, we all know that this is part and parcel of the out-of-control federal spending that's besieging our country, the tremendous deficit in terms of how much the government spends versus how much it brings in taxation. They continue year after year spending much more, upwards up to $1 trillion more per year, or $500 billion, mounting up the debt that the federal government owes. And I've long argued, as have many other libertarians, this cannot have a good ending. That you cannot have a system where the government is persistently spending a lot more money than what it's bringing in, adding to the debt load of the government. That ultimately the chickens are going to come home to roost. What do you think?
Well, obviously this is a crucial dilemma that the country is facing. That is basically the elephant in the room that nobody is choosing to talk about. The fact is, American debt, that is the federal government's debt, is growing astronomically. Just to give some benchmarks, when George W. Bush came into the White House in 2001, the national debt was $5 trillion. When he left the White House 8 years later, it had increased to $10 trillion. Now, at the time that Barack Obama left the White House, in his 8 years, the debt had again doubled from $10 to $20 trillion. The Congressional Budget Office, basically the group of economists and statisticians that are hired by both houses of Congress and approved by both liberals and conservatives to be the policy wonks to just sort of grind the data of what's likely to happen in the future given current legislation for government programs, they estimate that between now and 2027, the debt will have increased by another $10 trillion to around $30 trillion. Now, if you look at the actual pattern of government spending as to what is causing this, if you combine Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, the core, quote, entitlement programs that are sort of set in stone, which cannot be easily not budgeted for, in terms of what is called discretionary spending, but it's sort of like on automatic pilot unless legislation were to dramatically change the programs themselves. They make up approximately 60% of everything that the federal government spends today. Now, that is unsustainable. The federal government is growing at a rate of annual increase far exceeding the growth of the national economic pie. So while the economy is growing, the slice that goes to the government is increasing, And the amount that the government borrows and accumulates a debt to cover its expanding supply is expanding dramatically as well. And as we've seen in a number of countries, such as in Greece and Europe and so on, unless there are outside sources that are willing to fund and subsidize what will be an unsustainable welfare state from our own internal sources of tax revenue, something's got to give. There will be a day of reckoning. Greece had the fortunate circumstance of sort of getting the European Union, the International Monetary Fund, to give them lots of financial band-aids to prevent the catastrophe that was facing it just a couple of 3 years ago. Who's going to bail out the United States? Oh, Mars, Venus, Jupiter. The fact is nobody's there to do it. And this means a financial threatened catastrophe that's very serious. Now, does this mean that it's affecting us today or tomorrow or next year? Of course not. It's sort of like if you're using narcotics, it makes you feel good, and you keep taking a little bit more with each passing day because the effect of the euphoria is diminished as your body gets used to the dosage. But eventually, slowly but surely, these types of narcotics are eating away at your organs, at your mental capacity, and at the end of the day, it will result in bodily collapse and early death. There's no way around that from the use of these dangerous narcotics. Now, that is what we have. We are hooked on welfare state redistributive spending. People cannot imagine life without it. Politicians can't conceive of a world in which they don't have welfare state goodies to dangle in front of the voters to get their campaign contributions and votes on election day. And this is something that has to be faced by us as a nation. Now, of course, the most fundamental issue, as you were just saying, is that it has to be an awakening, not to just say, well, we're going to tweak Social Security. Well, we'll raise the retirement age. We'll change the index formula for how much the benefits increase each year as prices rise by a certain percentage, and so on. That is just like little Band-Aids over a fundamental problem. And that is, it is a sore, not just a financial sore in our country, but a sore that is affecting the character and quality of our nation and our people, in the sense of a growing dependency upon the state, in which individuals lose their sense of individual responsibility, individual respect for themselves, a sense of managing and controlling their lives as they think best, rather than a politically paternalistic father guiding them by the hand and caring for their health care, their retirement, and so on. The fundamental issue requires a change in the ideology and the political philosophy of the country. Now, that is not an easy matter, and it often takes a crisis to wake people up to a fundamental inconsistency and contradiction that's going on in their life. But that's what we're facing, and that's what makes the defense and the cause of liberty so important, to make people see the value of liberty, why they should want to be free, and making these decisions for themselves and their families themselves, and the necessity to accept that again, a philosophy of freedom to prevent the country from going over a financial cliff.
Yeah. The other factor is that there are so many people on the dole that, as you point out, there's that loss of self-reliance, independence. They get that mindset that they could not possibly survive without the dole, that their very existence is dependent on the continuation of the dole. And we see this especially in Social Security, which is the crown jewel of the welfare state. It was brought into existence under the Franklin Roosevelt administration. And a lot of the Social Security recipients, people of our age now, Richard, the boomer generation, they've convinced themselves of the same thing that previous generations had convinced themselves, that I'm just getting my own money back, that it's been put into a fund, and I'm now withdrawing it like an IRA or a savings account. Well, there's nothing of the sort. It's a straight transfer, confiscate and transfer program. Money is confiscated from the young people. the productive people, and it's just transferred to the older people, many of whom are, playing golf out on the golf course or living lives of luxury. There's a lot of wealthy people on Social Security. And I don't know of very many Social Security recipients that are calling for the abolition of the Social Security system. That their mindset is, we don't really care what's happening with young people. We don't really care what's happening to the country. That's not our problem. We put it in, and now we have a right to get it back. And the mindset is transferred to their children and grandchildren, many of whom are saying, oh, well, gosh, I hope there's Social Security when I get old, which is essentially saying, I hope there's young people that I can plunder and loot through the tax system when I get old, too, so that I can be playing golf when I get into my 60s and 70s. And the same mindsets with respect to Medicare, that the Medicare recipients, they're hooked on it. They don't want to give it up. That includes the doctors as well as the seniors that are on it. And you can go down the list, the recipients of farm subsidies, education grants. Once you get on the dole, you lose that sense of independence, that sense of self-reliance. And then if you confront these people and say, look, the country's in danger of going down. Look at Greece. We're looking at the possibility of a downward spiral that really ends up with national bankruptcy, a deep depression. Their attitude is, don't take my dole away, take the military's dole away. And that's the other half of this equation, is the warfare state. You've got the Pentagon, the CIA, that are out there starting all these wars, continuing these forever occupations, ginning up new crises now with China, with Iran, which means that they want more money. They know that their longevity depends on crises and chaos around the world. And when you tell them that, hey, look, we got a big problem here with out-of-control spending and debt, their attitude is national security state, take the Social Security recipients their money away from them. So there's really no way out of this as long as we don't eliminate the dole both on the welfare state side and the warfare state side. Otherwise, things are going to keep getting worse and worse. So when Trump comes in and says he's going to drain the swamp and he's going to really cut government spending, unless you're willing to address these programs, these massive welfare state programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and get rid of them, or the foreign empire, foreign military bases, foreign occupations, foreign wars, this country is headed towards some type of major economic catastrophe. Now, okay, one might say it could happen in a few years from now, but you never know. With a major crisis, you could have an accelerated downturn. Let's say there's a major war that the Pentagon succeeds at getting America involved in, and all of a sudden there's a run on the banks. People are concerned about their savings. One bank goes under, another bank goes under. And what happens if we're all of a sudden facing not just a crisis with one or two or three banks, but an industry-wide banking collapse? Where then does the FDIC get that money, which is, of course, another form of welfare? That's what we're looking at here, is a systemic problem. It's not a problem, as I've said for many years, Richard. It's not a problem with electing better people to public office or different people to public office. And that's what all the Trump supporters are saying. Oh, we finally got our man into office. He's going to make the welfare warfare state work. As I've long argued, this is a system problem. You've got a bad system here. The welfare state system, the warfare state system, and it's that system, regardless of who's running it, that is taking our country down.
Yeah, the difficulty, which you've alluded to and I was as well, is that what becomes the most difficult process of change and reform is the mindset that people come to have about their dependency on the state. A good number of years ago, I ended up being invited to give a keynote address at several state-level Farm Bureau annual conventions. Arkansas, Indiana, Iowa, if I remember correctly. And I found it very interesting to talk to the farmers as an example of this mindset. Now, this was about 20 years ago. So if I talked to farmers who then were, let's say, in their 50s, 60s, 70s. And I asked them, how did they feel about government farm price support programs? The large majority of them said, well, government really shouldn't be involved in the farm business. And if there was a way to get government out and no farmers still keeping it while I didn't, it was all fair, everybody had it taken away. Yes, government shouldn't be in the farm business. But then I would talk to their children or grandchildren, those people who were either working on or were now running the family farm business, of, let's say, in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and so on. Their mindset was totally different. They had lived their entire life in a world in which getting part of your revenue from a government subsidy program was as normal and taken for granted as the revenue earned by selling part of your farm produce to the marketplace and deriving your revenue ultimately from the consumers. For them, there was no difference. It wasn't that they were immoral, Jacob, or bad people. It was that they were amoral. They couldn't see the difference anymore between earning revenue by offering someone something freely in exchange that the recipient chooses to buy at an agreed-upon price, and receiving a wealth transfer through the government at taxpayers' expense, and viewing that as a legitimate part of their annual or regular revenue. This fact that people no longer see a distinction between, as Frederick Bastiat said long ago, illegal plunder and legal plunder, and not even seeing it as plunder. That is the psychological and philosophical and cultural dilemma that is really at the core of much of this problem that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I'm glad you brought up the moral argument. Because a lot of people just don't see that. The welfare state, as you point out, is so deeply ingrained in so many Americans. I mean, we're born under a welfare state. And we're taught that this is freedom. We're taught that this is moral, that America's a moral nation. And so when you're brought up under this system believing these things, it's very difficult to break free of them. I mean, that's sort of what distinguishes libertarians, is that we've broken free of the indoctrination. And so we challenge the whole welfare state at its moral base. We ask that question: what is the morality of forcibly taking one person's money and giving it to another person? I mean, in the private sector, we call that stealing. If I go and steal your money, Richard, and I go out and help the poor with it, I don't keep a dime of it myself. I just go and help a little old lady that needs an operation. I help a student that needs an education. I help only the poor. I'm still a thief. I mean, everybody recognizes that. I haven't used my own money, but somehow or another, when the government is involved in doing this, taxing people, taking the money, and then going out and helping the poor, the needy, and the disadvantaged, that somehow or another the entire nation, the taxpayers, the citizens, the children, the babies, the bureaucrats, the president, the Congress, the entire nation has now become this immoral nation because it's involved in really what amounts to, as you put it, legalized plunder, as Bastiat put it. And until people grasp that, the fundamental immorality of the system, they're going to consign themselves to reform. Oh, well, okay, let's get rid of Obamacare. And, wait, maybe we can fine-tune Social Security by lowering the retirement age. And none of it ever works. And that's because God has created a consistent universe, one where immoral means are going to beget very bad ends. And that's where we are now. In the beginning stages of a welfare state, the welfare statists have a lot of fun because there's a lot of wealth in that society. And so they think, oh, wow, we can take from the rich, only from the rich, and give it to the poor. But then all of a sudden, the recipient class starts getting larger and larger and larger. So they turn from the rich to the middle class. And finally, they turn to the lower classes where everybody's getting taxed to pay for the parasitic class. And that's when the system starts to cave in on itself, because the productive class cannot withstand the burden of not only all the welfare state transfers, not only all the warfare state transfers, but also the amount of money that's needed to service the debt.
Yes. the thing to keep in mind exactly what you're saying is that the dynamics of this, when there's only a handful of people, there seems to be a lot of wealth and a horn of plenty to draw upon. But many years ago, the famous Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises pointed out in his famous book Human Action that the welfare state reaches a point where the reserve fund has been drained and is no longer available to sustain the system. And what did he mean by the reserve fund? The fact of the amount of wealth that the society produces over and beyond the maintenance of the production itself, the capital structure, the amount of productive wealth that has to go into maintaining and increasing the amount of productive means to keep the engine going, the amount of reserve that enables us not to have a sustained life, but a relatively comfortable life. In other words, the fat in the system. But eventually, with the growth of the number of people dependent, with the extension of the regulatory state and the high costs of meeting those regulatory obligations on the part of businesses of all sizes, with the growth of other activities such as you particularly emphasize, the growth of American military and political foreign interventionism that cost a pretty penny. All of these things finally add up to threatening to absorb more of the wealth than the society can continue to produce. You have this for several reasons. You correctly pointed out. Increasingly, there are more people in the population who are now dependent to one degree or another upon the government than the net producers of the society. But at the same time, the more the tax burden falls upon this increasingly smaller portion of the productive members of the society, the greater one is running the risk of reducing their incentives to be as willing to work, save, and invest when so much of their income is being taken from them by the state to redistribute to others who are then receiving either all or an increasing part of the amount of income they have to live off. And the more that you tax, the more you take away the capacity for the economy to grow, the net wealth of the society to invest in more machines, better machines, newer machines, innovative new products. And then what Mises pointed out was the ultimate danger, and he saw this in his own country of Austria in the year between the wars, when it was suffering in the 1920s and early 30s from first hyperinflation, then heavy burdensome taxes, and then a Great Depression, that what you suffer from is the danger of no longer the usefulness of capital accumulation, but capital consumption, where now you're eating the seed corn, as the phrase goes. You've taxed away and consumed so much of the wealth away through government spending and welfare redistributions that you do not have enough wealth to maintain the productive capacity of the society. And then poverty is threatened on all as the economy reaches a tipping point and it shrinks rather than even hobbles along growing anymore.
Yeah, we're catching a glimpse of that now. I mean, the young people of today are having a hard time enough making ends meet, much less saving any money. And as you know, savings is the key to a dynamic rising standard of living. Through savings, you get increased productivity through the businessmen purchasing equipment, making workers more productive. And it's only through increased productivity that you can have these higher wage rates, growing wage rates. If nobody's saving any money, that leaves productivity just static. And so we see a glimpse of that already, where people are unable to add to the productive capacity of the country through their inability to put aside a nest egg in terms of savings. And then so it's just a matter of time. As things get worse and worse, people have to start digging into the savings that they have accumulated in order to just make ends meet. And then when that happens, as you point out, they're eating the seed corn. They're diving in and consuming the basis for what makes a dynamic society. Let's look at the historical context of this, Richard. I mean, America didn't start out this way. This is what a lot of Americans don't know. They go to public schools in the first grade, and they're taught that a welfare state has been here the whole time, and that they don't have any conception of the historical context in which the founding fathers, the framers, didn't bring a welfare state into existence. That was one of the things that made America unique as compared to all over the world. There was no programs where the state was involved in charity. The federal government was involved in charity. There was no Social Security, no Medicare, Medicaid. The idea was everybody, no income tax, no IRS. The idea was that everybody keeps everything he earns and decides for himself what to do with his own money, whether it's share it or spend it, invest it, hoard it, or whatever. That was the basis for what was considered a free society. And that existed for more than 100 years until all of a sudden the Franklin Roosevelt administration comes along, and that's where you had this wholesale change, revolutionary change, the conversion of the federal government to a welfare state. And it starts out with Social Security, and Roosevelt was brilliant. He knew that once he got the program enacted and he got people dependent on it, that was it, that people would then fight for the continuation of their dole. And one thing's for sure, the first Social Security recipients had not put any money, quote, into the system. They were living off the plunder that the government was taking from people in the midst of the Depression. But then you end up going with Medicare and Medicaid during the Johnson administration, who, of course, he was kind of like the acolyte of Franklin Roosevelt. And then you had all the rest of the stuff just expanding, the farm subsidies, the education grants, until such a point where, when Donald Trump says, well, he's gonna lower the cost of Air Force One by a few $1 million, big deal. I mean, we're talking about a massive problem here, and that problem is the entire welfare state, along with the fact that everybody who's on the dole doesn't want to dismantle the system.
Yeah, you see, we're actually seeing this now with this entire issue of what to do about Obamacare. At first, Donald Trump ran on a platform of saying that this is a disaster, and rightly. Premiums have gone up. You can't select your own doctor. The danger of the quality of availability of pharmaceuticals and medical access and so on. And he said, well, do away with Obamacare. Now, what are the Republicans talking about? Reform, tweaking, modifying. But why? Because it's the very point that you brought out about Franklin Roosevelt. And in fact, which the Republicans and the more forward-thinking conservatives and libertarians were clearly emphasizing back in 2009 and 2010. Once you institute this program, and a certain period of time goes by, and an increasing number of people become dependent on it and come to take it for granted, and their right to reverse it becomes extremely difficult. So now we're facing with Obamacare, after just a few years of its shaky and disastrous implementation, the same psychology of those who are now on it, as you're saying about Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. Once the addict is hooked, it's extremely difficult to get him to go in for cold turkey treatment. But at the end of the day, you have to go cold turkey and get your body healthy and no longer be tempted by the narcotic.
Yeah, your point about Obamacare is perfect, because for all these years since Obamacare was enacted, I kept telling conservatives, and I would talk to conservative audiences, and I would say, you're wasting your life devoting yourselves to getting Obamacare repealed. You ought to just go out and put your resources elsewhere, because even if you accomplish this, you're still left with a crisis. And then what are you going to do about the crisis? Because Obamacare was enacted in response to a crisis. And so if you get rid of it, you still have the crisis, along with the crisis that, as you point out, you now have with all the people that have become dependent on Obamacare. And conservatives didn't care. They just kept making this a campaign ploy. Conservative commentators, they would make it their life's mission to talk about Obamacare.
Yes.
Now that it's here, they're stuck with it because they're realizing that they don't have anything to replace it with. And in other words, they don't have any way to address the problem, the crisis that existed before Obamacare. And what is that crisis? That crisis is rooted in Medicare and Medicaid. And so unless you get rid of Medicare and Medicaid, you're just spinning your wheels. You're just spending your entire life and your resources talking about reform when it's going to accomplish absolutely nothing. And that's what distinguishes us libertarians, Richard. We raise people's vision to what the only real solution to this whole morass is, and that's a dismantling of the welfare state, an acknowledgement that it was a mistake, that it was a moral catastrophe, and that it's now time to restore the road that America should be on. That's the road to free markets, private property, limited government, and an abandonment of this road of socialism, interventionism, and, of course, imperialism on the warfare state front.
Yeah, you see the crucial element that is central to all of these discussions, whether you hear from the liberals and the progressives or from conservatives and Republicans, is that they all take for granted a presumption that individuals have a right to expect things from society. The only argument they're having is what form that entitlement should take and who's going to foot the bill and how it will be managed. The idea that it is not, quote, a right of an individual to expect to receive the wealth of another without that other's consent is nowhere in the debate. It's the entire issue of what does it mean to speak of individual rights? What is the meaning of privilege? And what is the definition of plunder? And what are the similarities and what are any differences when you're talking about the private sector versus government? Until those types of fundamental issues are right, the meaning of rights, privilege, plunder, and the role of government in a healthy society, we're just going to be kind of spinning the wheels that you're referring to.
Yeah, and I would add to that excellent list of questions, what should be the role of government in a free society? So on that note, Richard, we're out of time. As always, we greatly enjoyed the show and look forward to talking to you next week.
Till next time, take care.
All right, and thank you all for tuning in. Bye-bye.